When the lawyer read Dad's will, it felt like he left me nothing but silence. I always thought the day I would bury my father would feel like an earthquake ripping through my chest, but instead, it felt strangely muted, like the world had gone gray and soundless. The church bells tolled softly, the hymns dragged on, and relatives I hadn't seen in years leaned in with rehearsed words of sympathy. Yet through all of it, I felt a hollowness in my chest that I couldn't name. Maybe it was because I hadn't been prepared. Maybe it was because deep down, I had always believed that my father was too stubborn, too strong, too invincible to simply vanish. But death has no respect for pride. When the funeral ended, my siblings and cousins gathered together like crows circling a carcass. There were forced hugs and dry eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. I could feel the distance already forming. It was as though I wasn't one of them anymore, as though they were moving ahead with some plan I wasn't invited into. I thought I was just being paranoid. Grief does strange things to the mind, but the truth revealed itself faster than I expected. The following week, we were called to my father's attorney's office. His name was Mr. Connolly, a man whose face was as wrinkled as a leather-bound book and whose voice carried the dry authority of someone who had lived inside paperwork for decades. I remember the sterile scent of the office, the gleam of polished wood, the sound of an antique clock ticking loudly in the background. It felt less like a place of closure and more like a stage where something was about to be performed. We sat in a semicircle, my brother, my sister, two cousins who had always lingered around my father like moths drawn to light, and me. My hands trembled in my lap, not because I expected riches, but because I believed my father, even in his silence, would have left me something meaningful. Maybe a letter, maybe an object, something that tethered me to him beyond the grave. Mr. Connolly cleared his throat, and then he read. The words were simple, almost cruel in their vagueness. There was no list of properties, no bank accounts, no jewelry passed down through generations. Instead, it was a short statement about Connolly stacking the thin file neatly in front of him, his hand steady, his face unreadable. My siblings thanked him, their voices clipped and rehearsed before ushering themselves out. No one looked at me. No one spoke to me. It was as if they were relieved to finally cut me out completely, as though this moment had been long in the making. I stayed seated, my palms pressed against my knees, fighting the heat rising in my chest. I thought of all the nights my father had sat at the kitchen table, sipping black coffee in silence, his eyes distant. I thought of the stories he used to tell me when I was a little girl, stories that always had hidden morals buried inside. I thought of the way he would grip my shoulder whenever life got hard, steadying me with a rare softness that never showed in public. And yet here I was, left with nothing. Or at least, that's what they wanted me to believe. Later that evening, my siblings and cousins gathered at my brother's house. I wasn't invited, but I drove past anyway. Through the window, I saw them laughing, glasses of wine raised, as though they were celebrating the end of a burden rather than mourning the loss of a man who had raised us all. My stomach churned with a mixture of rage and disbelief. How could they be so at ease? How could they toast to closure when my father's absence felt like a gaping wound? I sat in my car, parked across the street, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. It wasn't about money. It was about truth. Something in my gut told me that what I had heard in Mr. Connolly's office was not the whole story. My father wasn't careless. He wasn't the type to leave loose ends. And he most certainly wasn't the type to erase me from his legacy. The thought began to gnaw at me. What if they had hidden something? What if my father had trusted the wrong hands and those hands had erased me? Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind looping through memories like old film reels. I thought of the last time I had spoken to my father. His voice had been faint, his body frail, but his words were oddly sharp. He had told me, some things are not meant for everyone. Some things are only meant for you. At the time, I thought he was speaking in riddles, maybe drifting in and out of delirium. But now, as I replayed the line, it struck me differently. Middle of the will, almost invisible in its simplicity. For the one who listens, The silence will speak. I froze. My pulse hammered in my ears. My father's handwriting had always been deliberate, and though this document was typed, the phrasing was unmistakably his. He had always spoken in cryptic sentences, weaving meaning into silence, turning riddles into lessons. This wasn't just a will, it was a message, a hidden doorway. I stared at the line until the words blurred. For the one who listens. That had to mean me. I had been the only one who sat with him in silence, who absorbed his quiet wisdom without needing explanations. He had always told me I listened differently than the others, that I could hear what went unsaid. The silence will speak. But what silence? And how? The realization hit me with the force of a cold wave. My father hadn't left me nothing. He had left me something only I could find. And if that were true, then everything my siblings and cousins had celebrated was built on a lie. My eyes locked on that phrase again, and in that moment I knew. The will wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. A secret was waiting for me, hidden in the silence my father had promised would speak. And I was the only one meant to hear it. It was like Dad had written a message only I was meant to read. The will was supposed to end things, but instead it opened a door I couldn't close. I sat at my kitchen table, the document spread out under the flickering light, reading the words again and again. All matters have been settled in advance. What remains should remain where it belongs. For the one who listens, the silence will speak. Most of it was ordinary legal filler, but that last line, it was his voice, my father's exact rhythm, the way he always spoke in riddles. It didn't sound like a lawyer. It sounded like him, speaking only to me. I copied the phrases into my notebook, pausing at each. Settled in advance. That was how Dad always thought. Prepare before the storm. Remain where it belongs. Not just a platitude, maybe a warning. And that last sentence, I knew it wasn't metaphor. He had left a message. As a child, I thought his games were just quirks. He'd like him, cedar, oil, peppermint gum. But the shelves were stripped, the desk emptied. They had already looted the place. Still, I knew his habits. He built that desk himself, and I remembered the hidden drawer. I slid my hand across the wood, pressed the seam, and it clicked open. Inside wasn't money or jewels, just an old children's book, The Quiet Map. The story of a girl who found her way home by remembering sounds and smells when signs failed her. As I thumbed the spine, I felt a ridge. A hidden seam lifted, and out slid a slip of paper. Dad's blocky handwriting. For the one who listens. And beneath it, 3,147. A number. I froze. Settled in advance. Remain where it belongs. It sounded like instructions. A safety deposit box. Somewhere he could place something beyond their reach. The theory hardened when I spotted a faint watermark in one of the book's illustrations. Tilted in the light, it formed the seal of West Elm Trust and Safe, the same bank where Dad had opened my first savings account. The trail was clear now. This wasn't grief twisting my thoughts. He had left me directions. That evening, word spread fast. A cousin texted pretending to worry about me, then casually asked if I'd found any cufflinks. My sister called, demanding the keys to close accounts. Their voices carried more urgency than concern. They didn't want me searching. I kept going. In his bedroom, a cigar box lay hidden under folded handkerchiefs. Inside was a flattened penny from West Elm Zoo. Scratched into its surface were 4 tiny marks, 3-1-4-7. The same number again. The will, the book, the penny, each a breadcrumb, and now a map pointing towards something they hadn't been able to erase. By dusk, I felt the weight of what I was carrying. If I was wrong, I'd be the family's joke, the grieving daughter who saw ghosts in paperwork. But if I was right, then Dad's final act of defiance was waiting for me, untouched, where only I could claim it. That's when the doorbell rang. The hall was empty, but on the doormat sat an envelope, the paper yellowed, my name scrawled across the front in handwriting that looked almost like Dad's. I carried it to the kitchen, slid a knife under the blocky scrawl I had memorized as a child while watching Dad fill out grocery lists or scribble reminders on scraps of newspaper. Trust only yourself. That was all it said. 4 words. 4 words that made the air in the room shift. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe my grief had conjured this. Maybe I had found an old note tucked somewhere and convinced myself it had just arrived. But the envelope had been on my doormat tonight. Someone had delivered it. Someone had placed it there, knowing it would find me, knowing I would pick it up. And the handwriting. God, the handwriting. I knew it. I could trace the peculiar slant of the T, the heavy downward stroke on the Y, the way the F always dipped just a little lower than it should, like he had pressed too hard with the pen. I had seen those marks on birthday cards, on sticky notes left on the fridge, on 100 small messages that had kept me tethered to him throughout my life. Even if his hand had been weaker in those final months, even if his strength had flickered, I recognized the intent. It was him. But how? Dad was gone. I had watched them close the casket. I had watched the ground cover him. I picked up the note again, my hands shaking, and read it for the 100th time. Trust only yourself. The words burned in my chest because they weren't advice. They were a warning, a plea from a man who had known what was coming, who had looked at his family and seen betrayal before it happened. He hadn't trusted them to protect me, or to protect whatever this key unlocked. He had trusted only me. I pressed the note flat against the table and stared at the key. The fob was worn leather, its edges smoothed from years of being handled. Embossed into the surface were 3 letters, W-E-T, and beneath them the number 3147. My breath caught when I traced it with my thumb. The number wasn't random. It was the same sequence I had pulled from the children's book, the same number he had left like a breadcrumb for me to follow. This wasn't coincidence. It was design. My stomach twisted. My father had left behind a map, and I was standing on process altogether. They were not afraid of grief, they were afraid of discovery. And now here I was, holding the very thing they hadn't wanted me to find. The fear hit me in waves. What if they knew already? What if they had been watching me, waiting to see if I would stumble onto what Dad had hidden? The envelope had appeared without sound, without warning. If someone could slip it under my nose, what else could they slip into my life? My walls suddenly felt porous, my locks flimsy. I drew the curtains tight, my heart slamming in my chest, and tucked the envelope and its contents back inside before placing it under the floorboard where I had once hidden my childhood diary. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like a silhouette. I kept replaying his words in my head. Trust only yourself. But trust myself with what? With knowledge? With danger? With proof of their betrayal? Or with something even bigger, something he hadn't dared speak aloud while alive? By morning, the exhaustion was so heavy that I sat slumped at the kitchen table, staring at a mug of coffee gone cold, when my phone rang. It was my sister. Her voice carried that brittle brightness I had come to despise. "Hey," she said, "just checking in." "How are you holding up?" The question was fake. The answer she wanted was compliance. "I'm fine," I said, my voice rough. "You've been quiet," she continued, her tone sharpening under the sugar. "We all just think it would be good for you to let things go. Dad's gone. There's nothing left to fight over." Her words were meant to sound like comfort, but they landed like a threat. There's nothing left to fight over. Except there was, and she knew it. I didn't answer. Silence stretched until she gave a little laugh that wasn't laughter at all. "You're not digging around, are you?" she asked suddenly, her voice low now, stripped of its sweet coating. I froze, my grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles hurt. "No," I lied. Another pause. Then a clipped goodbye, and she hung up. The air in the kitchen thickened around me. They suspected. They could feel me pulling at threads they had carefully knotted shut. For the next 2 days the phone didn't stop. My brother called to offer help with bills. My cousin dropped by unannounced, that could shatter what little family I had left. Or worse, put me in danger I couldn't predict? Yet the alternative was worse. To leave the box unopened would be to silence him forever. To ignore his words would be to betray the one person who had trusted me when no one else did. The decision came with a clarity that surprised me. I couldn't bury the past, not when it was clawing its way into the present. I had to see what he had left. On the third morning, before the sun had fully risen, I pulled the key from beneath the floorboard. Its cold weight steadied me. I slipped it into my coat pocket and drove to the bank. The city was still sleepy, the streets thin with early commuters. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, slick with sweat despite the cold. At every red light, I thought about turning back. At every green, I pressed forward. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of West Elm Trust and Safe, my stomach was in knots. The building stood silent, its stone facade catching the pale morning light, its tall glass doors reflecting the emptiness of the street. It looked less like a bank and more like a fortress, a place that kept secrets sealed behind layers of locks and rituals. I sat in the car for several minutes, gripping the key in my pocket, breathing in and out, whispering to myself that I could still walk away. No one knew I was here. No one could stop me if I turned back. But then I heard his voice in my memory, steady, low, patient. Quiet things are where the truth lives. And so I opened the car door. My legs trembled as I crossed the pavement, climbed the steps, and reached for the handle. The glass door was cold beneath my palm. I stepped inside. The lobby was quiet, the air crisp with the sterile scent of metal and paper. A clerk at the counter looked up, her polite smile automatic. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and approached. My hand went into my pocket, closing around the key until the teeth pressed sharp against my palm. "I need access," I said, my voice shaking despite my attempt at control. The clerk nodded and extended her hand. I opened my fist and placed the key in her palm. As the clerk turned it over, her eyes flickered with recognition, and she whispered, almost to herself, "Box 3147. Your father said only you would come." The building suddenly felt less like a bank and more like a mausoleum, a place where lives were catalogued and buried in metal drawers, waiting for the right hands to pull them free. The clerk stopped at a thick door at the end of the corridor. She pressed her ID against the scanner, entered a code, and then gestured for me to step forward. "Your signature," she said, sliding a clipboard toward me. My hands shook as I signed, the pen dragging clumsily across the paper. She unlocked the door, and the air inside was cooler, quieter. Rows upon rows of safety deposit boxes stretched along the walls like tiny sealed tombs. She moved with careful precision, her shoes echoing against the polished floor, until she stopped at a box halfway down. She inserted the key, turned it, and then stood back as if what came next wasn't hers to witness. The drawer slid out with a metallic groan that seemed too loud for the stillness of the room. She placed it on a long wooden table in the center, and then, almost reverently, pushed it toward. The sound of metal against wood was sharp enough to make me flinch. "Take your time," she said, her voice low, and then she stepped away, giving me privacy but not distance. I could still feel her eyes on me, watchful, cautious. My breath caught as I looked down at the box. I had imagined money, maybe documents, something cold and transactional. Instead, when I lifted the lid, I saw pieces of my father's life laid bare. Bundles of letters tied neatly with twine, their edges yellowed with time. A stack of photographs, black and white fading into color, the kind of images that carried not just faces, but eras. And then, nestled beneath them, was a journal. Its leather cover worn, its clasp locked shut as if it carried weight no one else was meant to bear. The sight of it undid me. My throat burned and my eyes filled before I could stop them. For the first time since his funeral, I felt like he was sitting across from me again. Not the man who had been buried in silence, but the man who had lived in layers, who had hidden riddles inside bedtime stories and wisdom inside ordinary phrases. He had left me not money, not property, but his voice, his truth, holding objects that didn't belong to any version of his life I had been told. And then there was the journal. I reached for it slowly, my palm pressing against the cracked leather cover. The lock was small, almost decorative, but its presence was enough to tell me that what lived inside was not meant to be carelessly read. I lifted it, felt the weight of it settle into my hands, and a shiver went through me. This was the center of it all. The letters and photos were fragments, but this was the map, the heartbeat, the secret that had been waiting for me. I wanted to open it right there, to pry the clasp with my bare hands, but fear rooted me to the chair. Because what if I wasn't ready? What if the words inside didn't bring me closer to him, but instead pulled me further away? What if the truth was uglier than the silence? My tears fell onto the cover, darkening the leather, and I whispered his name into the air like a prayer. Dad, why? Behind me, the clerk cleared her throat gently, a sound that made me jolt. I had forgotten she was still in the room. She didn't move closer, but her gaze lingered on the journal in my hands, as if she knew its weight. Your father came here often, she said carefully, almost cautiously. He was particular about this box. He made it clear it was meant for you. Only you. Her words sliced through me. Only me. He had anticipated this moment, orchestrated it, trusted me with pieces of his life that he had hidden from everyone else. And in that trust was a shadow. Because if he had needed to hide it, then he had known betrayal. He had known that the rest of the family could not be trusted, that their greed, their manipulation, their eagerness to erase me from the will wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. They wanted to bury what he had protected. I pressed my hand against the journal again, my resolve solidifying. Whatever was inside, I couldn't turn away. The clerk's voice softened, dropping to a whisper that made the hair on my arms rise. Your father said only you would come. Her words lingered in the sterile air, wrapping around me like a warning and a promise all at once. My pulse thundered as I closed the journal back into the box, realizing that resistance. It wasn't meant to open easily, not without intent. I had left the bank that day with the box's contents tucked into a satchel, the clerk's whisper still echoing in my ears. Your father said only you would come. Her tone hadn't been casual. It had been solemn, like she was passing on a burden that had been waiting in silence. And now here I was, back in my apartment, the letters, photographs, and journal spread across my table, staring at me like a jury. The letters came first. Each bundle was bound tightly with twine, and the paper had yellowed with time. Some were addressed, others were not. The ones with names, most of them I didn't recognize, felt like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even begun to assemble. But their content chilled me. Again and again, words leapt out from the pages. Betrayal, trust broken, enemies close to home, silence required. One letter, dated years before his death, mentioned that he had been cornered into signing documents he didn't believe in, that those I trusted most now sharpened their knives against me. Another hinted at assets hidden for safekeeping and dangers of discovery. My breath caught as I pieced them together. This wasn't the private melancholy of an aging man. This was deliberate documentation, the writing of someone who had known he couldn't speak the truth aloud. He had lived inside a storm, pretending calm for the world, while in secret he chronicled every betrayal, every theft, every shadow that circled our family. And then there was the journal. I ran my fingers over its cover again, wondering if the lock was truly meant to keep me out, or if it was meant to keep everyone else out until it reached my hands. I searched the box for a key, but there was none. For a moment, I thought about forcing it open, but something stopped me. My father wasn't careless. If he had hidden this for me, then he had left a way to open it. I just had to find it. So instead, I opened the letters again, looking for patterns. And that's when I noticed something strange. Certain words in the letters seemed deliberately misspelled, not in a careless way, but in a way that drew the eye once you knew what to look for. The first letters of these errors, when strung together, began to form sequences. Numbers sometimes, short words other times. My pulse quickened as I realized he had been coding his letters. The closet. My father hadn't left me wealth. He had left me danger. He had left me tangled in whatever war he had been fighting quietly all those years. Was this his way of protecting me? Giving me tools to finish what he couldn't? Or had he just dragged me into the same darkness that had eventually taken him? I closed my eyes, remembering him at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. The weight in his gaze that I'd mistaken for weariness. Maybe it had never been weariness. Maybe it had been fear. The fear pressed into me now, because the more I read, the more I understood. My father hadn't just been betrayed. He had been hunted. And if that were true, then whoever had been after him would come for me once they realized I was following his trail. Already, the family was circling. My sister had called twice that day, her voice sharpened with suspicion. "Why aren't you returning our calls? Where have you been disappearing to?" she demanded, as if she had the right to keep tabs on me. My brother sent a message that read like a warning cloaked in care. "Don't drive yourself crazy chasing ghosts. Some things are better left alone," I wanted to scream at them. Tell them I knew what they had done, that I had proof in my hands. But I couldn't. Not yet. Because proof wasn't enough unless I understood the whole story. And the story was locked inside the journal. I placed it on my nightstand, the leather cover catching the dim light, as if daring me to sleep beside it. I couldn't. Every creak in the building made me sit up. Every gust of wind against the window felt like a hand pressing against the glass. By the third night, exhaustion caught up with me. I had spread the letters across the floor, the journal at the center like the heart of a constellation, when my body gave in and I drifted into a restless sleep on the couch. I woke to a sound that didn't belong. At first it was faint, the scrape of metal against metal. My heart stuttered in my chest. I held my breath, listening. Then it came again, louder this time. The unmistakable sound of my lock being tested. My eyes flew to the table, the journal, the letters, my father's secrets laid bare. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the satchel, stuffed everything inside with clumsy heart hammering so violently that I could barely breathe. For a split second, I told myself it could have been the neighbors or a branch snapping outside. But then I heard it again. The sharp crunch of glass scattering across hardwood, this time inside my apartment. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a storm. Someone was here. My father's satchel was still clutched against me, my arms wrapped around it like armor. In the dim light of the lamp I had left on, I could see the shattered pieces of my living room window glittering across the floor. A cold wind rushed through, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of danger, the metallic tang of something broken, something breached. I dropped low to the ground, every instinct screaming at me to hide. My hands shook so badly that I could barely crawl without making noise, but I forced myself toward the hallway. My body pressed into the shadows as footsteps creaked against the floorboards. They were slow, measured, deliberate. Whoever was here wasn't panicking. They knew exactly what they were looking for. I backed into the corner of the hallway, crouched against the wall, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The satchel dug into my ribs. Inside were my father's letters, the photographs, and, most important, the journal. The one object I had promised myself I wouldn't let slip into the wrong hands. The footsteps grew closer. My living room chair scraped as if it had been moved aside. Drawers opened, objects shifted. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They wanted me to know they were tearing through my space. My skin prickled with terror, but beneath it was something sharper. Anger. This was my home. This was the last place I had thought I was safe, and now even that was gone. I held my breath and waited. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, moving toward the broken window. I dared to peek down the hallway, just far enough to catch the shadow of a figure slipping back into the night. I didn't see a face, just a shape, tall, broad-shouldered, deliberate. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness outside. I didn't move for several minutes. My muscles burned from staying pressed against the wall, but I couldn't bring myself to stand. When I finally forced myself, because what would I say? That my dead father had left me a coded will, a locked journal, and proof of betrayal that had just led to a break-in? They would laugh. Or worse, they would file it as just another burglary in a city that had too many already. But I had to. The dispatcher answered quickly, her voice calm.
I stumbled through the words. Break in, window shattered, intruder gone. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived, their flashlights sweeping through the wreckage. They asked me the same questions in different ways. Did I see the intruder? Could I describe him? Was anything missing? I hesitated. If I told them about the journal, if I admitted what was inside the satchel at my feet, I risked handing over my father's secrets to people who wouldn't understand, or worse, people who might pass them along to exactly those I needed to hide from. So I shook my head. Nothing's missing, just damage. One officer scribbled on his pad, the other gave a sympathetic shrug. Looks like a random burglary, he said. They probably thought you weren't home. Just kids, maybe. Wrong place, wrong time, I wanted to scream. Kids don't pick through drawers. Kids don't know where to look. Kids don't leave without taking the TV or the laptop. This wasn't random. This was a message. But when I opened my mouth, all that came out was a bitter laugh. Yeah. They boarded up the window, gave me a case number, and told me to call if anything else happened. Then they were gone, leaving me in the cold silence of my broken apartment. I sank to the floor, the satchel still clutched against me, and for the first time since finding the envelope on my doorstep, I felt truly alone. The paranoia pressed down hard. Who could I trust? Not the police, not my family, not even the people who claimed to care. My father's warning repeated in my mind like a heartbeat. Trust only yourself. I dragged myself to my bedroom, exhausted, and dropped the satchel onto the bed. I needed to check, to reassure myself that nothing inside had been touched. I opened the flap, pulling out the bundles of letters, the photos, stacking them carefully on the quilt. But when my hand reached for the journal, my stomach dropped. It wasn't there. I tore through the satchel, emptying it completely, my breath coming fast and shallow. After the break-in, I barely slept. Every sound outside my apartment felt amplified, every shadow on the wall a threat. The journal's absence gnawed at me like a raw wound. Losing it wasn't just about losing my father's words. It was losing the one thread that connected his silence to the truth he had been trying to leave. But even without the journal, I still had the letters and photographs, fragile fragments of a man I thought I knew but clearly never fully understood. I spread them across my kitchen table again, my eyes scanning every line, every ink blot, every misspelled word that might hide another message. The more I pieced together, the more one name kept surfacing. It wasn't always written the same way. Sometimes it was just an initial. Other times a vague reference like the partner or the man in the room. But eventually one full name appeared buried inside a line about betrayal. Never trust H. Whitmore. He sharpens his smile like a blade. I froze when I read it. Henry Whitmore. The name rang through my memory like a bell. I had heard it whispered in family conversations, always in tones laced with respect, even fear. He had been my father's longtime business partner, a man whose presence seemed to hover over family gatherings even when he wasn't there. He was the kind of figure people spoke about carefully, as though words alone might draw his attention. I remembered him vaguely from my childhood, tall, immaculate, a presence that swallowed every room. He had a way of shaking hands that felt more like claiming ownership than greeting. And now, here he was, scrawled in my father's letters as the man who couldn't be trusted. I flipped through the stack until I found more. References to meetings where Whitmore had pressured my father into signing papers. Mentions of transfers that my father resisted but eventually allowed, fearing what would happen if he refused. One line made my blood run cold. They will erase her if I resist. Her. Me. I pressed my hand to my mouth, my pulse hammering. My father had been protecting me, not just from the betrayal of my siblings, but from this man. Whitmore wasn't just a partner, he was a predator. The photographs only deepened the unease. Letters suggested that he had convinced my siblings to side with him, to shut me out, to rewrite the legacy so that I would inherit nothing. My father, cornered and betrayed, had hidden what he could. He had buried his truth in codes and journals, waiting for the day I would find it. And buried inside one particularly long letter was the most shocking line of all. The estate belongs to her, though they will deny it until the end. My hands shook as I read it again. The estate. Not a piece of land, not a single property, but the entire legacy. Everything my father had built, everything he had worked for, was rightfully mine, and they had taken it from me. The anger surged so hot that I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. All those nights I had lain awake wondering why I had been left with nothing, why I had been excluded from the will, why my siblings treated me like an outsider. It wasn't because my father didn't care. It was because he had been forced into silence, because Whitmore had orchestrated it all. And now, without the journal, I had only pieces of proof. Enough to terrify me, but not enough to bring him down. I tried to imagine what was inside the journal. If the letters held this much, then the journal must have been his full confession, his account of every stolen dollar, every coerced signature, every betrayal. And now it was gone, stolen from my apartment, probably already in the hands of the very man my father had feared most. The paranoia settled deep into my bones. I stopped answering calls from my siblings. I ignored texts that demanded to know where I had been. I didn't tell anyone where I was going or when I'd be home. I couldn't risk it. If Whitmore had them in his pocket, then I was surrounded by enemies wearing the faces of family. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. At the grocery store, on the subway, even in the hallway of my building. It was the kind of paranoia that makes you second-guess reality. But I knew it wasn't just in my head. I remembered the sound of my lock turning, the shadow slipping out my window. Someone had been inside my home, and they had taken exactly what they wanted. Still, I kept digging. I photocopied, gathered the letters back into the satchel, my determination hardening. I couldn't let his story end this way. I couldn't let Whitmore win. The next morning, I forced myself to return to work, trying to cling to some semblance of normalcy. But the normal world felt foreign now. Every conversation tinged with suspicion, every smile potentially false. I sat at my desk, the letters hidden in my bag, and tried to focus on the glowing screen in front of me. That's when I felt it. The weight of a gaze. I glanced up, my stomach twisting, and there he was. Through the glass wall of my office, standing just outside on the street, Henry Whitmore watched me. His suit was immaculate, his posture relaxed, as though he had simply been out for a stroll. But his eyes, cold, deliberate, never left mine. And then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, not a gesture of recognition or kindness. It was sharp, calculated, the kind of smile my father had described in his letters, a smile sharpened like a blade. My breath caught as I realized that the man my father had feared most wasn't just a name in the past. He was here, alive, and watching me. And from the look on his face, he already knew exactly what I had discovered. It wasn't strangers who betrayed Dad. It was the people sitting at our dinner table. Seeing Henry Whitmore's smile through the glass was enough to send me spiraling, but the deeper I sank into my father's letters, the more I realized the nightmare didn't start with him. The betrayal hadn't only come from outside, it had festered inside our own walls. For weeks after Dad's death, I had forced myself to believe my siblings were simply careless, that their coldness at the will reading was the product of grief warped into detachment. But the letters revealed something else. References to documents signed behind his back, signatures forged, contracts altered. And in every mention, my siblings' names sat beside Whitmore's like accomplices. One note in particular made me sick. My father had written, "They changed the will before it was read. Not my words, not my hand, but theirs. Rewritten under his direction. I can't fight all of them at once." My breath caught the moment I read it. If this was true, then the will I had sat through at Mr. Connolly's office, the will that had toys and homework and who got the last slice of pizza. These were the people I had defended when they were in trouble, the people I had loved even when they didn't deserve it. And now, they were my enemies. The grief of losing my father deepened into something darker. Grief for the family I thought I still had. I needed to be sure. One night, I invited my sister to meet me for coffee. She arrived polished, composed, her eyes sharp even as her lips stretched into a brittle smile. For a while, we danced around small talk, sipping our drinks in an atmosphere so tense I could hear the hiss of the espresso machine like a scream. Finally, I pushed. Why did Dad's will sound nothing like him? Her cup froze halfway to her lips. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she set it down, leaned back, and let out a small laugh. Grief makes things feel stranger than they are. It wasn't grief. It was wrong. He wouldn't have written that. She tilted her head, her smile tightening. You've always had an imagination. It's one of the things I liked about you when we were kids. But sometimes, imagination hurts more than it helps. Gaslighting. Smooth. Deliberate. She wanted me to doubt myself, to swallow the truth until it turned sour in my gut. I leaned forward. He wrote about Whitmore. I know. Her expression didn't crack, but her hands tightened around her cup until her knuckles whitened. You don't know what you're talking about, she said quickly, too quickly. I studied her face. There it was, the flicker of fear. And in that moment, I knew for certain. She was lying. When I pressed further, she shifted tactics. She sighed, softened her tone, and reached across the table like an older sister offering comfort. You're tired. You've been through so much. We're just trying to protect you from getting lost in things you don't understand. Protect me, as though cutting me out of my father's legacy was for my benefit. I pulled back before her touch could land. Protect me, I repeated, my voice flat. She didn't flinch. She just picked up her cup again and said, Some things are better left buried. The words chilled me. She might as well have been quoting Whitmore himself. That night, I called my brother. His reaction was even worse. When I hinted at Whitmore's involvement, his tone turned cold, almost mocking. You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy? They had chosen to erase me. For days, the weight of their betrayal pressed down until I could hardly breathe. I walked through the city in a haze, seeing other families together, laughing over dinners, bickering on sidewalks, and I felt a hollow ache that no truth could fill. I had lost my father, but I had also lost the people who shared his blood with me. Still, my father's voice whispered through the silence, Trust only yourself. I clung to the letters like lifelines, scouring them for more. Each phrase, each cryptic note felt like another handhold on a cliff face I was climbing in the dark. I began to map out names, dates, places. Patterns emerged. Transactions, property transfers, sealed deals. Whitmore's shadow stretched long across every page, but so did the fingerprints of my siblings. And then, one night, while rereading the most battered of the letters, something slipped free. A small, thin object pressed between the folds. I almost missed it. It was a cassette tape, no label, just the faint smudge of my father's handwriting on the side. Play me. My breath hitched. I scrambled to find an old player, dusting off a relic I hadn't used in years. My fingers shook as I pushed the tape inside and pressed play. At first, there was only static, the hiss of time eroding sound. And then, his voice. My father's voice. It cracked with age, but it was unmistakably him. If you're hearing this, he began, his tone low, urgent, then they've already lied. They've already buried what belongs to you. They've already betrayed me. Tears blurred my vision, spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. Hearing him again felt like resurrection and heartbreak all at once. He paused, then said my name. Clearly. Directly. The sound of him calling me from beyond the grave filled the room, and in that moment, I knew the lies I had uncovered were only the beginning, and the truth he had left behind was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. When I heard Dad's voice again,
his voice heavy with resignation, they've betrayed me, and they will betray you. I covered my mouth with one trembling hand, the tears spilling faster now. I had waited for someone, anyone, to tell me I wasn't crazy, that my suspicions weren't just the product of grief and paranoia. And now he was telling me himself, from beyond the grave. The recording crackled, his words breaking in and out like a faulty radio. Trust is dangerous. The ones closest are the ones who... His voice dissolved into static for a few seconds before returning, clearer, sharper.
like he had leaned closer to the microphone. Whitmore cannot be trusted. The name landed like a punch. I knew it. I had seen him, standing outside my office, smiling as though the whole game were his to control. Hearing Dad say it out loud, in his own voice, confirmed everything I feared. But he didn't stop there. "Your brother," he said. The words almost choked. "Your sister. They've made their choice. Don't let their lies bury you the way they buried me." My body went cold. He had known. He had seen their betrayal coming, maybe even long before I did. He had known they would side with Whitmore, that they would cut me out, that they would rewrite his story and leave me in the shadows. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, sobbing quietly, listening to him lay out the truth I had carried like a suspicion for weeks. "I couldn't fight them," he admitted, his voice weary but steady. "But you can. You must. I've left you the pieces. Letters, journal. Follow them. They will lead you to what belongs to you, to what's yours." My chest tightened. The journal, the letters, the breadcrumbs he had hidden inside bedtime stories, photographs, cryptic notes. He had been building this roadmap for years, waiting for me to find it. And I had. I had followed his trail this far, but the journal, the most important piece, was gone, stolen from my apartment during the break-in. My stomach clenched at the thought. Whoever had it now wasn't just holding words, they were holding evidence. Proof of fraud, theft, corruption. Proof that I was the rightful heir. Proof that my siblings had betrayed him. Proof that Whitmore had orchestrated it all. "I know you're afraid," Dad's voice said. "About vindication." It was about reclaiming my father's voice, the one they had tried to erase, the one they had buried under legal documents and false signatures. And as I listened, I felt him with me, not as a memory, but as a presence, guiding me, reminding me that I wasn't imagining any of this. The recording crackled again, more violently this time. And for a terrifying moment, I thought it was going to cut off completely. But then his voice returned, urgent now, the calm stripped away. "If you're hearing this," he began, his words clipped, hurried, "then they already know." And then it ended. The tape snapped to silence. I sat frozen, my breath caught in my chest, replaying his final words over and over. "They already know." Who? My siblings? Whitmore? The intruder who had stolen the journal? Or all of them together, circling me even now, aware that I was chasing the truth he had left behind? The room felt colder, smaller, like the walls were pressing in. I rewound the tape, desperate to hear him again, but the ending was the same, cut off at the same point, leaving me stranded in silence. My father had given me instructions, yes, but he had also given me a warning, and the warning wasn't about the past, it was about the present. They already knew, which meant I was no longer just searching for the truth. I was being hunted by it. I stared at the cassette player, my hands trembling, as I realized that whoever had betrayed my father now knew exactly how far I'd come, and they weren't going to let me keep going. Everywhere I turned, their eyes were on me, waiting for me to slip. After the recording ended, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls had ears. My father's last words, "If you're hearing this, they already know," were no longer just ominous. They were proof that every step I took, every secret I uncovered, was being tracked. It started subtly, a missed call from my brother, followed by another, then a string of messages that blurred the line between concern and control. "We need to talk. Where have you been? You can't disappear like this." My sister's texts came next, calculated, patronizing. "You're grieving in unhealthy ways. Come home, we'll help you." But the help wasn't about me. It was about silencing me before I pieced everything together. Only carried me so far. I needed facts, not just fear. So I turned to the one place my family couldn't manipulate so easily: the paper trail. My father had left clues in his letters, references to accounts settled and transfers undone. At first they read like fragmented thoughts, the ramblings of a man burdened by secrets. But when I lined them up chronologically, something emerged, a pattern of deposits, withdrawals, property titles that shifted names in ways that didn't make sense.
I pulled old statements, tax forms, anything I could salvage from the box. That's when I found them. Accounts I had never heard of, tucked under shell companies with meaningless names. Transfers that moved money in circles only to vanish into offshore banks. But every path, no matter how twisted, seemed to end in the same place, Whitmore. It was bigger than I had imagined. He hadn't just stolen my father's wealth, he had built an empire on it, hiding behind the cooperation of family who were willing to look the other way as long as they got their share. And in the middle of those records, one line stopped me cold. A deed transfer, dated just weeks before my father's death, that listed me as the beneficiary. My name, typed clearly before being scratched out in later versions of the same document. The replacement? My brother's name. My hands trembled as I traced the line with my finger. They had erased me, literally erased me. My father had tried to leave me something real, something tangible, and they had stolen it before the ink was even dry. Anger surged, hot and sharp, cutting through the fear. My grief, once a chain, was becoming something else entirely. Determination. If they thought they could erase me, they were wrong. But the more I dug, the more dangerous it became. My boss at work pulled me aside one morning, his expression strained. "I've been getting calls," he said. "Anonymous complaints. People saying you're unstable, that you've been stealing office time for personal business." I stammered, shocked, but he held up a hand. "I don't want to believe it, but I can't protect you if this continues." It was them, my family, Whitmore. They weren't just circling me at home.
Them. But determination only went so far against fear. One evening, after a long day of combing through photocopied records at the library, I walked back to my car under the dim glow of the parking lot lights. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. I was tired, my bag heavy with documents, my mind clouded with Dad's voice on the tape. That's when I saw it. Tucked beneath the wiper blade of my car was a folded piece of paper. My stomach dropped before I even touched it. I glanced around the lot. Empty. Too empty. I unfolded the paper slowly, my hands trembling. The words were scrawled in thick, uneven strokes, hurried but deliberate. "Stop, or you'll end up like him." My knees weakened, and I gripped the car door to steady myself. It wasn't just surveillance anymore. It was a threat. A promise. And the message was clear. They weren't going to let me finish what my father had started. I crushed the note in my fist, my pulse hammering as the echo of my father's last words returned to me. They already know. Now I knew exactly what he meant. And I also knew one thing for certain. I couldn't run anymore. I had to fight. Dad's real legacy wasn't money. It was the truth they tried to bury with him. The note on my windshield still burned in my pocket like an ember that refused to die. I couldn't forget the jagged handwriting, the weight of the threat. "Stop, or you'll end up like him." For hours it haunted me, echoing in the silence of my apartment. And yet it only made me more determined. Fear no longer paralyzed me, it clarified me. If they were desperate enough to warn me, then I was close, closer than they wanted me to be. I returned to the letters and the scraps of evidence my father had left behind. The journal was gone, stolen in the break-in, but the letters still carried pieces of its voice. And the cassette tape, his voice recorded in secret, reminded me that he had built redundancies into everything, expecting resistance, anticipating betrayal. He knew the journal might be taken. He knew I would need another way forward. So I went through every document again, slower this time. My eyes tracing as children, signatures that were just a little. My father had caught them. He had documented everything, and then they had silenced him. The grief pressed. He hadn't died only of illness, as they had let me believe. He had been broken down, slowly, piece by, until his voice could no longer rise above. They had buried not only his body, and they had expected it, but it hadn't. He had made sure of that. The more I pieced together, the clearer the picture became. My father had written of pain carried in silence, of trust stolen at the dinner table, but also of resilience.
He had hidden assets, small portions he had managed to protect, tucked under names only I would recognize. One company, registered in the Cayman Islands, was named after a bedtime story he used, Quiet Lantern Hall. Another, based in Switzerland, was under a false surname my mother had used once when traveling. The clues were deliberate, breadcrumbs left for me to follow. Each one carried not just financial weight, but emotional significance, as if he had wanted me to know that he hadn't given up, even when everything seemed lost. And then came the line that changed everything. In a letter dated 2 months before his death, written in his heavy hand, he had scrawled, "The estate belongs to her. The proof lies in the ledger. If they erase it, the companies will speak for." I stared at the words until they blurred. It wasn't just symbolic. It was legal. If I could connect those offshore assets back to him, if I could prove the fraudulent transfers, then I wasn't just chasing ghosts. I was the rightful heir. For the first time, the grief shifted into something else entirely. Not the greedy hunger my siblings had embraced, but the power of truth. My father's pain was in every line of those letters, every forced signature, every whispered recording. But so was his resilience. He hadn't left me empty. He had left me the tools to fight. And I would. I gathered the documents into a thick file, each page a weapon to something sharper. "Where did you get this?" "My father," I said simply. He studied me for a long moment before leaning back in his chair. "This isn't just suspicion. This is evidence, strong evidence, enough to challenge the will, enough to expose fraud." A surge of relief rushed through me, hot and dizzying. For weeks, I had felt like I was screaming into a void, my words dismissed as imagination. But here, finally, was someone who saw it, who validated it. But the relief didn't last. He closed the file slowly, deliberately, his gaze never leaving mine. "If you move forward with this," he said, his tone heavy, "your family will come after you. Not just in court. Personally. They'll destroy you if they can. Are you prepared for that?" His words landed like a stone in my chest. Prepared? How could anyone be prepared for war against their own blood? Against siblings who had once held my hand at the dinner table, cousins who had shared holidays, a family that had already cut me out once and would now come for me with teeth bared. But as his question hung in the air, I thought of my father's voice on the tape, his words etched into my bones. "Trust only yourself." I thought of the forged signatures, the erased deed, the smile Whitmore had given me outside my office, sharpened like a blade. Was I prepared? Number. But was I willing? Absolutely. I met the lawyer's gaze, my voice steady. Yes. He hesitated, then nodded, sliding the file back toward me. "Then you need to understand something. Filing this won't just challenge the will, it will expose everything. It will put you at the center of a storm you can't step back from." I placed my hand on the file, feeling the weight of my father's legacy pressing through the paper. That's exactly where I need to be. The lawyer leaned forward, his eyes grave, and whispered, "Then prepare yourself, because once this is filed, your family won't just fight you in court. They'll try to destroy you in every way they can." The moment I challenged my family, they stopped being blood and became predators. The day I filed the claim, the air in the courthouse felt sharper, heavier, as if even the walls knew what I was about to unleash. My father's file sat under my in years, all gathered as though this were a performance. Whitmore wasn't there in person, but his shadow stretched across the room through the presence of his lawyers, slick, practiced men who moved like predators circling prey. I laid out the evidence, the offshore accounts, the altered deed, the forged signatures. My voice trembled at first, but as I read my father's words aloud, his warnings, his pleas, his coded notes, I felt him steady me. Each piece I presented was another stone pulled from the wall they had built around his truth. But my family came armed too. Within hours, they began their counterattack. Their lawyers painted me as unstable, a grieving daughter chasing conspiracy theories.
They waived psychiatric records I didn't know they had access to. Therapy notes from years ago, when I had gone through a bout of depression after college. They twisted it into evidence of delusion. My siblings sat quietly as their attorneys said the words out loud. Unreliable, unstable, unfit. They didn't flinch. They didn't defend me. The smear campaign spread outside the courtroom. Articles appeared online, fed to journalists by anonymous sources. Posts circulated on social media about my fragile mental state, whispers of debt, fabricated stories about erratic behavior. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Colleagues at work grew distant, their conversations shifting when I entered the room. My boss, already strained by the anonymous complaints, pulled me aside again and said he couldn't ignore the perception issues. Within a week, I was suspended, pending review. I was losing not just the case, I was losing my life. The betrayal cut deeper when it came from those I had once trusted most. A cousin I had grown up with, who had shared summers at the cabin and late-night secrets, took the stand against me. His voice shook as he testified that my father had confided in him about my unreliability. He said Dad worried about leaving me too much responsibility, that I lacked the stability to handle it. It was a lie. A rehearsed, brutal lie. And yet, he spoke it with such conviction that even I almost doubted my own memory. My father had never said those things. He had left me breadcrumbs at me. I had no allies, no safe space. My lawyer was competent, even sympathetic, but he was not family. He couldn't fill the ache left by the realization that the people who shared my blood had chosen to poison me rather than protect me. Still, I kept pushing. I gathered more evidence, combed through more records, hunting for anything that would tip the scales back in my favor. I reminded myself that my father hadn't just left me grief. He had left me a roadmap. The offshore companies, the coded notes, the cassette tape. They were my lifelines, even as the world closed in. Then, just as I began to feel the faintest flicker of hope, the hammer fell. At the next hearing, the judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel, listened intently as both sides presented their arguments. For the first time, I saw him lean forward when my lawyer laid out the proof of the altered deed, the erased beneficiary line where my name had once stood. His eyes narrowed at the inconsistencies. For the first time, I felt the balance shift. And then, just as my lawyer prepared to press the point further, the defense interrupted. One of Whitmore's attorneys rose, a smug expression playing across his face. He carried a thick folder, sealed and stamped. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "we have new evidence, submitted last night." The room shifted. My heart dropped. The judge took the folder, his face unreadable as he flipped through the pages. Silence stretched, long and suffocating, before he finally looked up. "This changes things," he said gravely. "The case is paused until I can review this thoroughly." My stomach twisted. New evidence. Submitted overnight. By them. I didn't know what was inside that folder, but I knew it wasn't truth. It was another weapon. Another forged nail in the coffin they were building for me. As the judge adjourned the hearing, I caught sight of my sister's face, serene, victorious, her lips curling into the faintest smile. And in that moment, I knew the war wasn't just about what my father had left behind. It was about whether I would survive long enough to claim it. It wasn't just me on trial. It was Dad's entire legacy. The courtroom was colder than usual that morning. The chill sank through my suit jacket and into my bones, but it wasn't the air conditioning. It was the atmosphere. Benches, nodding along to every word their side spoke, their unity sharpened against me. And there I was, alone at my table, my father's file resting in front of me like a fragile shield. My lawyer leaned close, his voice low. "They're pulling everything they can. Stay steady," I nodded, though my insides were unraveling. I wasn't just fighting for money or property or even my name. I was fighting for my father's truth, for the voice they had tried to bury under forged documents and whispered lies. The trial began with the prosecution of me, their attempt to dismantle my credibility piece by piece.
They called witnesses who spoke of my fragility, neighbors who claimed I was obsessed with conspiracies, coworkers who repeated the poison of the smear campaign. Each word was a needle, pricking holes in my composure. Then came the evidence. Photographs of altered documents that painted me as the manipulator, not them. Bank statements that had been doctored to show transfers into my name, falsified to make me look like the thief. The sting was unbearable. Not only were they rewriting my father's legacy, they were trying to brand me as the villain in his downfall. My lawyer objected again and again, but the damage was done. Murmurs filled the room. My siblings sat taller, smug satisfaction radiating from their silence. I wanted to scream, to stand up and shout that every line was a lie, every image doctored, every testimony bought. But rage wouldn't save me here. Only proof would. And then, just as despair threatened to close in, proof walked back into my hands. It happened during recess. As I sat in the hallway, my hands buried in my hair, a court clerk approached quietly. "This was turned in for you," she said, her voice neutral. She placed a small sealed package on the bench beside me. My breath caught. The weight, the shape. It was familiar. Too familiar. I tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was the journal, my father's journal, the one stolen from my apartment. For a moment, the world spun. Who had returned it? Why now? It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was here, in my hands, its leather cover warm from where the clerk had carried it. I flipped it open, scanning page after page, my heart pounding. Just use it. When the judge called us back to order, my lawyer rose, the journal in his hand. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "new evidence has come to light." The room erupted in murmurs as the journal was handed to the judge. He opened it, flipping slowly, his eyes narrowing as he read the entries. The silence grew heavy, charged, as every eye in the courtroom strained to read his expression. Meanwhile, my siblings shifted uncomfortably at their table. My brother's jaw twitched. My sister's mask of calm cracked, just slightly, as she realized what had resurfaced. Their lawyers whispered furiously, shuffling papers, already plotting their next move. I sat straighter, watching them squirm, feeling my father's presence steady me. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was his voice finally breaking free of the silence they had forced upon him. The rest of the day unfolded like a battle fought in words and glances. My lawyer read passages aloud, my father's handwriting ringing in the courtroom like testimony from beyond the grave. Each entry painted the truth they had tried so desperately to hide. Each word stripped away another layer of their carefully crafted lies. My siblings' lawyers attacked, of course. They called the journal forged. They claimed it was fabricated after his death. They insisted it couldn't be authenticated. But the dates matched. The references aligned with documents I had already presented, and the codes, when explained, tied directly to the offshore accounts that traced back to Whitmore. It became a psychological war as much as a legal one. My siblings glared at me across the courtroom, their eyes burning with a mixture of fury and fear. They whispered to each other, their unity cracking at the edges. I could see it, the doubt, the blame beginning to seep between them. For every lie they spoke, I answered with my father's words. For every attempt to smear me, I stood taller, channeling the resilience he had carried in silence for so long. The grief that had once hollowed me now became fuel. Each accusation bounced against the steel of my resolve. By the time the sun dipped low outside the courthouse windows, the air inside was electric with tension. The judge sat silently, the journal open before him, his hand resting on its leather cover as though it were something toward him, breath held, waiting for the words that would decide not only my future, but the legacy my family had spent years trying to bury. I sat with my hands clasped in my lap, my heart pounding in my ears. Across the aisle, my brother's posture was stiff, his eyes darting between the judge and the floor. My sister's composure cracked at last, her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands fidgeting despite her effort to stay serene. Behind them, the cousins who had once cheered at my exclusion shifted uneasily, the certainty draining from their faces. The judge cleared his throat.
his voice steady, grave. "The evidence presented, including the financial records, offshore accounts, altered deeds, and the journal of the deceased, demonstrates a clear pattern of fraud, coercion, and conspiracy. It is the decision of this court that the will submitted previously is invalid." The words rang like a bell. Invalid. Every falsehood they had built, every forged page, every manipulation, they were ashes now. The judge continued, his tone firm. "The rightful heir, as intended by the deceased, is his daughter. Assets and properties are to be restored under her name." My chest seized, then released. The tears came hot and fast, but they weren't grief anymore. They were relief. They were vindication. For the first time since my father's death, I felt like I could breathe again. I closed my eyes and felt him beside me. Not as a memory, not as a ghost, but as justice. He had fought in silence. He had endured betrayal, and now, through me, his voice had finally broken through. The courtroom erupted. My brother leapt to his feet, his voice raised in fury, shouting about lies and manipulation. My sister hissed at her lawyers, demanding appeals. Cousins muttered in disbelief, their whispers frantic, as though they had just watched the ground split beneath them. But I didn't hear them clearly. Their outrage was only noise against the steady thrum of my father's victory. The press was waiting outside, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Reporters shouted questions about the fraud, about Whitmore, about the scandal tearing through what had once been a respected family name. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The truth was loud enough without me. In the days that followed, the collapse was swift. Articles flooded the news. Inheritance felt less like wealth and more like restoration. Not of money, but of my father's honor. They had tried to strip him of dignity, of voice, of legacy. They had failed. Yet victory wasn't simple. Winning didn't erase the sting of betrayal. My siblings were still my blood, and seeing them reduced to desperation was both satisfying and heartbreaking. At night, when the adrenaline wore off, I would sit with the journal beside me, running my fingers over his words, and wonder if he had imagined this moment, if he had pictured his children torn apart in public, their unity shattered beyond repair. But then I remembered the pain in his letters, the loneliness in his voice on the tape. He had known what they were capable of. He had known they would rather destroy him than share. This wasn't my doing. It was theirs. And I refused to carry guilt for the choices they had made. The day I returned to the cabin was the day it all became real. The property was mine again, legally and irrevocably. The woods smelled of pine and memory. The porch creaked under my weight, the way it had when I was a child. I stepped inside and felt the air heavy with him, with us. On the mantel sat an envelope I had never noticed before, its edges yellowed, its seal unbroken. My breath caught. It was addressed in his handwriting, to me. I carried it carefully to the table, my hands trembling. For all the truths I had uncovered, for all the secrets I had decoded, this felt different. This wasn't hidden in riddles or codes or offshore accounts. This was his last word, sealed and waiting. I slid my finger under the flap, my heart hammering in my chest, the sound of it echoing in the silence of the cabin. As the envelope opened, revealing the letter inside, I knew that whatever words I was about to read weren't just for closure. They were the final truth my father had saved for me alone. It was the first time I truly heard my father's voice, not as a victim, but as a man who believed in me. The paper felt fragile in my hands, thin enough that I was afraid it might tear under my trembling fingers. Yet the weight of it was heavier than anything I had carried so far. I sat at the table in the cabin, his cabin, now mine, and stared at the neat, deliberate scrawl of his handwriting. My name was written. You've always seen what others don't. You've always listened where others only hear. I pressed the letter to my chest, my sobs breaking the silence of the cabin. For months I had felt like I was chasing shadows, like every clue was only proof of how much I had lost. But here, finally, was proof of how much he had believed in me. He wrote of his regrets, how he had stayed silent too long,
how he had let Whitmore's threats and my siblings' betrayal corner him into isolation. I should have spoken sooner, he confessed, but I thought silence was protection. What I learned too late was that silence can also be a prison. He told me he wasn't proud of how fear had kept him still, but he was proud that I had refused to be still. You've already done what I couldn't, he wrote. You broke the silence. You carried my voice where I could not. That is your strength, not mine. That is your inheritance. The words cracked something open in me. For so long I had carried my grief like a wound, my betrayal like a scar. But now, reading his final letter, I realized that he hadn't left me broken. He had left me whole. The letter shifted from confession to wisdom. Legacy is not money, not property, not the weight of what others think belongs to them. Legacy is truth. Legacy is courage passed down like blood. They tried to strip you of the first two, but they could never touch the last. That's why it was always you. Not your brother, not your sister. You. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, the tears relentless but cleansing. I thought of the courtroom, the way they had sneered as their lies unraveled, the way Whitmore's empire began to crack. I thought of how small I had felt when the will was read, how invisible when my siblings raised their glasses in celebration of my exclusion. And I thought of the woman I had become, the woman who had stood in court with my father's journal in her hands, who had faced their poison and not only survived but triumphed. This letter wasn't just closure, it was transformation. Toward the end, his words grew softer, almost tender. Grief will never vanish, but it will change. It will become something you can carry without breaking. And when it
Handed down. Not wealth, not property, courage. I folded the letter carefully, pressing my hand over my name one last time. I felt lighter, steadier, as though some invisible hand had lifted the weight I had been carrying since his funeral. Outside, the woods whispered in the wind, the same sound I had grown up with. For the first time in months, I felt peace, not because everything was resolved, but because I finally understood what mattered. The inheritance wasn't the accounts, the properties, the verdict in court. It was this moment, this letter, this truth. And yet, as I placed the letter back in its envelope and set it gently on the mantel, I couldn't shake the thought that lingered. If my father had left this for me, sealed and waiting, what else had he hidden that I hadn't yet uncovered? And more importantly, what secrets were still buried in my family that might never see the light? If this story pulled you in, I want to hear from you. If silence can be inherited, then so can courage. So which would you choose, and why? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share the video with someone who loves shocking family mysteries, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next reveal.